They had already decided he was guilty before anyone asked what really happened. And out here in Dry Creek, that was usually enough to end a man's story before it even had a chance to be told. The rope hung still in the dry afternoon air, not swinging, not moving, just waiting, like the people gathered beneath it, and Ethan Cole stood with his hat in his hands, dust clinging to his boots, the smell of leather and sunbaked wood thick around him, his face calm in a way that made some of them uneasy, because men about to be judged don't usually stand that still, don't usually look like they're listening to something far away instead of the voices rising around them, voices that spoke over each other, building a version of truth out of fragments and fear. He shamed her, one man said, not loudly, but firmly enough that others nodded. And that was all it took, because once a story found roots in this town, it didn't need proof to grow, it just needed enough people willing to believe it. And 20 feet away, near the edge of the crowd, Nayeli stood with her shoulders drawn in, a torn piece of fabric held close against her chest, her dark hair still damp, catching the light in uneven strands, her eyes moving from face to face, not pleading, not accusing, just searching, as if trying to understand how something so simple had become something so heavy. The sheriff stood off to the side, hat low, fingers resting near his belt, but not quite ready to act, because even a badge didn't weigh much against a crowd that had already made up its mind. And somewhere in the distance a loose shutter knocked softly against a wall, slow, steady, like a clock marking time no one could stop. And if you had been there, if you had walked into that moment without knowing the hours that came before it, you might have believed the same thing they did. You might have looked at the torn fabric, the distance between the man and the woman, the silence that stretched between them, and filled it with your own assumptions. Because 3 hours earlier the sky had been a different color, darker, heavy with rain that came fast and left the river swollen beyond its banks, turning a quiet crossing into something wild and unpredictable. And Ethan had been riding the edge of it, tracking a stray calf, when the sound cut through the wind, not loud, not clear, but human, and that was enough. It always was. He turned his horse without thinking, boots pressing into the stirrups as he followed the sound down toward the water where the current twisted around rocks like it had somewhere to be. And that's when he saw her, a figure caught in the pull, fighting to stay above the surface, her hands reaching for something that wouldn't hold. And there are moments a man chooses and moments that choose him. And this one didn't leave room for hesitation. He moved before the thought could settle, dropping from the saddle, boots hitting the mud before the river took the rest of him in, cold and forceful, pulling hard against his chest, his arms, everything he had. And when he reached her, when his hand closed around her arm, he felt the fabric tighten, then give, a sharp tear that echoed louder than it should have. Because sometimes it's not the sound itself, but what it becomes later that gives it weight. And he pulled her free inch by inch, the current fighting for both of them, until the ground rose beneath his boots and the river let go. And she was there, breathing, alive, but already pulling away, her hands clutching what remained of her clothing, her eyes wide not with gratitude, but with something closer to fear, not of him, but of what it might look like to anyone watching. And up on the ridge, there had been watching, two riders pausing just long enough to see a man holding torn fabric and a woman stepping back from him. And in a place like this, that was all it took to build a story strong enough to carry across miles of dust and into the center of a town that didn't wait for explanations, only conclusions. And now, standing beneath that rope, Ethan could feel the weight of that moment pressing down, not the river, not the struggle, but the space between what happened and what people believed had happened. And he didn't speak, not because he had nothing to say, but because he knew how little it would matter once a crowd decided which version of the truth it preferred to carry. The town did not quiet after the truth hung in the air. It shifted, like wind changing direction without warning. And the men who had been standing closest to Ethan took half a step back without realizing it, boots scraping lightly against the packed dirt, their eyes no longer fixed on him but drifting, uncertain, searching for something to hold on to now that the story they had built was starting to crack. And Sheriff Walter Briggs cleared his throat, not loud, not commanding, just enough to remind everyone he was still there, though even he did not seem sure what to do with the silence that had settled in, because silence in Dry Creek was rare, and when it came, it usually meant something had gone wrong, Nayeli stood where she had spoken, her voice no longer echoing but still present in the way the air felt heavier around her. And she did not lower her gaze this time, did not retreat. She simply stood, shoulders straight, the torn fabric still in her hands, but no longer something to hide behind. And Ethan watched her for a moment longer before shifting his attention to the crowd, not with anger, not with accusation, just with a quiet steadiness that made some of them look away first, because it is easier to face a man who shouts than one who does not need to. And somewhere behind the line of onlookers a woman muttered something about misunderstanding, her voice low, almost lost, but it was enough to start a ripple, small at first, then growing as others began to adjust their stance, their certainty, their version of what had happened, and the rope above remained still, untouched now, no longer the center of attention but not forgotten either, just hanging there like a reminder of how close things had come to going the wrong way. And Sheriff Briggs finally stepped forward, his boots slower than usual, his hand lifting slightly, as if to say something official, something that could restore order to a moment that had slipped beyond his control. But the words did not come right away, because what could he say that would not reveal how easily he had allowed things to unfold, how quickly he had let assumption take the place of duty, and in that hesitation, the weight of the moment deepened. Ethan placed his hat back on his head, the motion simple, unhurried, as if he were preparing to leave rather than waiting for permission, and that, more than anything, unsettled the crowd, because it suggested he did not belong to their judgment anymore, that whatever power they thought they had over him had already slipped through their fingers. And Nayeli took a step closer, not toward the sheriff, not toward the crowd, but toward Ethan, closing a distance that had felt much larger only minutes before. And for a brief moment their eyes met again, not with urgency, not with fear, but with a quiet understanding that did not need to be spoken aloud, because both of them knew how easily things could have gone differently, how thin the line had been between truth and something else entirely. And from the edge of the gathering one of the men who had first spoken stepped forward, his hat in his hands now, his voice uncertain as he said that maybe they had been too quick, maybe they had not seen it clearly from the ridge, maybe there had been more to it than what they thought. And the words were clumsy, incomplete, but they carried something new, something that had not been there before, a willingness to admit that they had been wrong. And that kind of admission did not come easy in a place like this. Sheriff Briggs nodded once, slowly, as if accepting that this was the closest thing to resolution they were going to get, and he adjusted his stance, straightened slightly, finding his voice at last as he said there would be no further action, that the matter was settled, though the way he said it made it clear the matter was not what had truly changed, it was the people. And as the crowd began to loosen, to break apart into smaller groups, conversations low and cautious, Ethan turned to leave, his steps steady, measured, each one carrying him farther from the center of something that had almost claimed him. And behind him Nayeli remained for a moment longer, watching, not as someone who had been saved, but as someone who had chosen to speak when it mattered. And in that choice there was a kind of strength that did not need to be proven. Again, not today, and not in front of people who were only just beginning to understand what they had nearly done. The dust did not settle right away after a moment like that. It lingered, hanging low in the afternoon light, as if even the air needed time to decide what had just happened. And Ethan Cole walked past the edge of the crowd without looking back, his boots steady against the packed earth, each step carrying the weight of something he had not asked for and did not intend to carry any longer. But even as the space opened behind him, the feeling of eyes remained, quieter now, less certain, but still there. And in Dry Creek people did not forget quickly, not because they held on to truth, but because they held on to stories, and stories had a way of shifting just enough to protect the ones who told them. Behind him Sheriff Walter Briggs watched the man leave, his jaw set in a way that suggested he was thinking harder than usual, not about what had been said, but about what had almost been done. And there is a difference between the two that a man does not always notice until it stands right in front of him. Unmoving, undeniable. Nayeli remained near the center of the square for a moment longer, the crowd thinning around her, voices lowering into quiet exchanges, and she could hear pieces of it, fragments of doubt, of reconsideration, of people trying to fit what they had just witnessed into the version of the world they understood, but she did not stay for them. She turned slowly, her steps measured, following the same direction Ethan had taken, though she kept her distance, not out of fear, but out of respect for a silence that had not yet finished speaking between them. The road out of town stretched wide and pale under the sun, lined with dry grass that bent slightly in the wind. And for a while there was only the sound of boots against dirt and the distant creak of wood from buildings settling back into stillness. Ethan did not slow, did not turn, but he knew she was there, not by sound, but by something else, something quieter, the kind of awareness that comes when two people share a moment that cannot be undone. And after nearly 50 yards, he stopped, not abruptly, just enough to break the rhythm of his steps, and when he turned, his expression was the same as before, steady, unreadable, but not closed, not entirely. Nayeli stopped as well, leaving several feet between them, the wind moving gently between that space, carrying the faint scent of river water that had not yet left her clothes. And for a moment neither of them spoke, not because they did not have words, but because they both understood that words, once used, could not be taken back. And finally Ethan spoke, his voice low. Even, you did not have to. And it was not a question, not quite a statement either, just something in between, something that left room for an answer without demanding one. Nayeli held his gaze, her eyes steady now, no longer searching, and when she spoke, her voice carried the same quiet strength it had in the square. Yes, I did, she said, and there was no hesitation in it, no doubt, just certainty, the kind that does not come from obligation, but from choice, and that choice hung between them, simple and heavy at the same time. Ethan nodded once, slowly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, because out here, that was sometimes the closest thing to understanding a person could offer. The wind picked up slightly, brushing past them, lifting the edges of her torn fabric, and for the first time since the river, Ethan noticed the way she held it, not like something broken, but like something that had served its purpose, and could now be set aside. And there was a lesson in that, though he did not put it into words, did not need to, because some things were meant to be carried without explanation. And as the town behind them continued to shift, to settle into a quieter version of itself, neither of them moved right away, not because they were unsure of where to go, but because for a brief moment, standing there on that open road, they understood that what had happened was not just about a misunderstanding. Corrected, it was about something else, something deeper, something that would not stay behind in Dry Creek when they walked away, and somewhere back in town. The rope still hung where it had been left, untouched. Now, but not meaningless, because it remained as a reminder of how close silence could come to costing a man everything, and how a single voice, spoken at the right moment, could change the direction of an entire story without ever raising itself above a calm, steady tone. The road did not offer answers, only distance. And sometimes that was the closest thing a man could get to peace. Ethan Cole resumed walking after that brief exchange, his pace unhurried but certain, as if he had already decided where he was going long before the town tried to decide who he was. And Nayeli followed again, not close, not far, just within the kind of distance that allowed space without breaking connection. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting longer shadows across the open land, stretching them out like reminders that everything eventually grows larger than the moment that created it. And after nearly a quarter-mile the road split. One path, leading toward the low hills where scattered ranches sat miles apart, the other bending toward a line of trees that marked the edge of Apache land. And Ethan slowed there, not because he was unsure, but because some choices deserved to be acknowledged, even when they were simple. He glanced once toward the path that led back to his own place, a small spread of land with a leaning fence and a water trough that needed fixing, then toward the other, where the land shifted into something older, quieter, shaped by people who did not leave their stories written on wood and nails but carried them in memory. And when he turned, it was toward his ranch, not out of reluctance, but because it was where his work waited, and work, out here, was often the only thing that kept a man steady. Nayeli stopped at the fork, her eyes following him for a moment, and there was no disappointment in her expression, no expectation either, just understanding. Because paths do not need to cross forever to matter. Sometimes it is enough that they meet. At the right time, she adjusted the torn fabric in her hands, then let it fall loosely at her side, no longer holding it tight, no longer letting it define the moment it came from. And as Ethan walked a few more yards, he heard her voice again, not loud, not calling him back, just enough to reach him across the space between them. "They will remember this," she said, and he paused, not turning right away, because he knew she was not speaking about him. Not entirely. She was speaking about the town, about what they had almost done, about how close they had come to letting something false become something final. And when he did turn, his expression carried a faint shift, something softer, though still held in place by years of choosing silence over words. "Maybe," he said, and there was no certainty in it, only a quiet acceptance of how people worked, how memory bent over time, how truth could fade if it was not carried carefully. Nayeli studied him for a moment, then nodded once, as if that answer was enough, as if she understood that what mattered was not whether the town remembered, but that she had spoken when it counted. And that was something no one could take from her. The wind moved through the grass again, brushing past both of them before continuing down the road. And for a moment it felt like the land itself was settling, like something had been corrected in a way that did not need to be announced. Ethan turned back once more and continued toward his ranch, the distance between them growing naturally now, not forced, not resisted, just part of the way things moved forward. And Nayeli remained at the fork a little longer, watching until his figure became smaller against the wide stretch of land, until the details blurred into shape and motion, and then even that faded, and she turned toward the trees, her steps light but certain, carrying her back toward a place that understood her without question. And behind them both, Dry Creek sat quieter than it had that morning, not because it had changed completely, but because it had been forced, if only for a moment, to see itself more clearly. And sometimes that was where change began, not in loud declarations or sudden shifts, but in a single pause, a single voice, a single choice to step forward when it would have been easier to remain silent. And though neither Ethan nor Nayeli spoke of it again, the space between what happened and what could have happened remained, like a line drawn in the dust, faint but real, waiting to see who would remember it the next time a story began before the truth had a chance to arrive. The ranch did not ask questions when Ethan returned. It simply waited, the fence leaning the same way it had that morning, the gate creaking with a familiar sound as he pushed it open, and the cattle lifted their heads just long enough to notice him before settling again, because out here, a man's troubles did not carry the same weight they did in town. The land only cared that he showed up, that he did the work, and Ethan moved through it with quiet purpose, checking the trough first, running a hand along the rim where the wood had begun to split, a problem he had been putting off for weeks now. But today he did not put it off. He picked up the tools without hesitation, setting them down beside the post, his movement steady, almost deliberate in their simplicity, as if each task was a way of placing something back where it belonged. And the sound of hammer against wood carried out across the dry field, sharp, clean, a rhythm that did not argue, did not accuse, just existed. And for a while that was enough. But the mind does not always follow the hands. And even as he worked, the image returned, not the rope, not the crowd, but the moment before it all, the river pulling hard, the fabric tearing. The look in her eyes when she reached the bank, not gratitude, not yet, but something caught between fear and understanding. And he paused then, resting the hammer against the post, letting the quiet settle in around him again. The kind of quiet that did not erase what happened, but gave it space to be seen clearly. And somewhere beyond the low ridge, where the land shifted toward the trees, Nayeli walked a different path, one that did not follow fences or markers, her steps guided by memory more than direction. The sound of the town already fading behind her, replaced by the softer rhythm of wind through branches and the distant call of birds settling into the late afternoon. And she did not look back, not because she wanted to forget, but because she understood that what needed to be carried forward did not require her eyes to stay fixed on what had passed. And in her hand, the torn fabric remained, lighter now, no longer something to shield herself with, but something to remember, not the moment of tearing, but the moment after, when the truth had to be spoken. And she slowed near the edge of the trees, her fingers loosening their grip until the cloth slipped free, caught briefly by the wind before settling against the dry grass. And she left it there, not discarded, not abandoned, but released, because some things are not meant to be carried beyond the moment that gave them meaning. And back at the ranch, Ethan finished securing the post, stepping back to test it, his weight pressing lightly against the wood until it held firm, and he nodded once, more to himself than anything else, before moving toward the small cabin that stood at the edge of the property, its door slightly ajar, the interior dim but familiar, and he stepped inside, setting his hat on the table, the same table where he had eaten alone more nights than he cared to count. And for a moment he stood there, not moving, not reaching for anything, just letting the stillness settle, because the kind of day he had just lived through does not end when the sun lowers. It lingers, it waits to see what a man will do with it. And outside, the light shifted, stretching shadows longer across the land, connecting things that had been separate in the bright hours of the day. And somewhere between the town and the trees, between the river and the road, something had changed, not in a way that could be pointed to or measured, but in the quiet understanding that truth, once spoken, does not return to silence the same way it came. And whether Dry Creek would remember or reshape it into something easier to carry, that was a question for another day. But for now, the land held steady, the wind moved as it always had, and two people walked different paths with the same unspoken knowledge that a single moment, chosen carefully, could stand longer than any judgment made in haste. Morning came slower than usual, not because the sun delayed its rise, but because the land itself seemed to hold on to the quiet just a little longer, as if it, too, was considering what had passed the day before. And Ethan Cole stepped out onto his porch with a cup of black coffee in his hand, the steam rising thin and steady into the cool air, his eyes scanning the stretch of land that belonged to him, the fence he had repaired standing firm now, the cattle moving lazily beyond it. And for a moment, everything looked exactly as it should, the kind of stillness a man builds his life around. But beneath that stillness there was something else, something he could not quite name, not trouble, not regret, just awareness, the kind that settles in after a moment refuses to leave quietly. And he took a slow sip, letting the bitterness sit on his tongue as his gaze drifted toward the distant line of trees, where the land shifted into something less defined, something that did not belong to him. And somewhere beyond that line, Nayeli walked a different morning, her steps light against the forest floor, the scent of pine and earth replacing the dry dust of Dry Creek. And the people she passed did not look at her with suspicion or question. They nodded, some briefly, some with quiet recognition, because here, her presence did not need explanation. And yet, even in that place, the memory of the town lingered, not heavy, not burdensome, but present, like a distant echo that reminded her of the moment she had chosen to speak. And she carried that choice with her, not as something to dwell on, but as something that had already done its work. And back at the ranch, Ethan set the cup down on the wooden railing, his fingers resting there a second longer than needed before he turned back inside, the day waiting in small, practical ways, a loose hinge on the barn door, a saddle strap that needed stitching, things that required attention but not thought, and that suited him fine. He moved through the motions with practiced ease, each task completed without hesitation, but the mind has its own rhythm, and even as his hands worked, pieces of yesterday surfaced, not in full, but in fragments, the sound of wind through the crowd, the look in the sheriff's eyes when he realized what had almost happened, the weight of silence just before Nayeli spoke, and then her voice, steady, clear, cutting through everything else without raising itself. And he paused again, needle held between his fingers, thread pulled tight, but not yet set. And there was a moment where he considered what might have happened if she had chosen differently. If she had stayed silent, if she had turned away, and the thought did not sit long, he let it pass. Because out here, a man learned quickly that dwelling on what could have been did not mend fences or feed cattle, but it did leave something behind, a quiet respect for the kind of courage that did not announce itself, that did not come with force or volume, but arrived in the form of a simple decision made at the right time. And he finished the stitch, pulling the thread through with a firm motion, setting the strap aside before stepping back into the sunlight, the day warming now, the air losing its early edge. And as he moved toward the corral, a figure appeared at the far edge of his land, small at first, barely more than a shape against the shifting light. And he stopped, not reaching for anything, not reacting with alarm, just watching, Because out here, not every arrival meant trouble, and as the figure came closer, the distance closed slowly, deliberately, until it became clear who it was. Nayeli walked toward the fence, her pace steady, her expression calm. Not urgent, not hesitant, just present, and Ethan remained where he stood, waiting, not because he expected anything, but because some moments deserved to meet halfway. And when she reached the fence, she did not cross it. She simply rested her hand lightly on the top rail, her gaze meeting his across that simple boundary. And for a second, neither spoke, not because they had nothing to say, but because both understood that whatever came next did not need to be rushed. And the land around them held still, as if listening, as if aware that something quieter, something more lasting than yesterday's noise, was about to take shape in the space between them. The fence between them was nothing more than weathered wood and habit, a line drawn by hands long gone. Yet, in that moment, it carried the weight of two worlds learning how to stand without stepping over each other. Ethan Cole rested his hand on the top rail opposite hers, not gripping it, just letting it be there, the sun climbing higher now, warming the space between them. And for a while neither of them spoke, not out of uncertainty, but out of recognition that silence had already done enough work for one story, and words, when they came, should be chosen with the same care as stepping into a river that might pull you under. Nayeli was the first to break it, her voice calm, steady, carrying the same quiet strength that had held an entire town still the day before. "Your fence," she said, her eyes shifting briefly to the repaired post. "It will hold now." And it was a simple observation, but not a meaningless one, because out here, noticing what a man fixed mattered more than asking what he had lost. Ethan followed her gaze, nodding once. "It will," he said, and there was something in his tone that suggested he understood she was not only speaking about wood and nails. And the wind moved lightly across the field, brushing against the grass, carrying with it the faint sound of cattle shifting in the distance. A reminder that life did not pause for moments like these. It moved through them, shaping itself quietly around whatever had changed. Nayeli's hand slid along the rail as she walked a few steps beside it, not crossing, not testing the boundary, just following its line as if tracing the edge of something she had already decided to respect. And Ethan moved with her on the other side, keeping the same pace, the same distance, two people walking parallel without needing to close the space. And after a few yards she stopped again, turning slightly, her expression thoughtful but not heavy. "In Dry Creek," she said, "they looked at you like they knew your story, and there was no accusation in it, just a statement of what had been seen." Ethan let out a quiet breath, not a sigh, just the release of something small. "They always do," he answered, his voice even. "It is easier that way." And he did not say more, because he did not need to explain how a man becomes something in other people's eyes long before he ever speaks. How a single moment can be shaped into a truth that fits whatever they are ready to believe. Nayeli studied him for a second, then nodded slowly. "Where I come from," she said. "A story is not told until everyone who lived it has spoken." And the words settled between them with a different kind of weight, not sharp, not challenging, but steady, like a stone placed carefully where it would not move. And Ethan considered that, his eyes lowering briefly to the ground before lifting again. "That would take time," he said, and there was a hint of something there. Not quite a smile, not quite doubt, just recognition that such a thing did not belong to places like Dry Creek. Nayeli's lips curved slightly, not fully, but enough to show she understood the difference. "Yes," she said, "but it would be closer to the truth." And the wind picked up again, stronger this time, moving across the field in a visible wave, bending the grass in one direction before letting it rise again. And for a moment, both of them watched it, not because it was unusual, but because it was simple, and simplicity had a way of grounding things that felt larger than they needed to be. Ethan shifted his weight, resting both hands on the fence now. "You came back," he said after a pause, not questioning, just acknowledging. Nayeli met his gaze. "I wanted to see if the story ended there," she replied, and there was something deeper beneath that. Something unspoken about how stories do not always end where people think they do. How sometimes they continue in quieter ways, in smaller moments that carry just as much meaning as the ones that draw a crowd. Ethan nodded once more, understanding that much at least. It usually does, he said. Out here. And he gestured slightly toward the open land, toward the distance where the town sat unseen but not forgotten. People remember the loud part, then move on. Nayeli's eyes followed his gesture, then returned to him. Then maybe this one should be different, she said, and she did not raise her voice, did not push the idea. She simply placed it there, like a thought that could be picked up or left behind. And Ethan did not answer right away, because some ideas are not meant to be accepted or refused in the moment they are given. They are meant to settle, to find their place over time. And as they stood there, the fence between them no longer felt like a barrier, but like a marker of where something had begun to change, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough that both of them could feel it. The kind of change that does not announce itself, but stays quiet and steady long after. The noise has passed. The wind carried her words farther than either of them expected, not in distance, but in weight, settling somewhere between them and the land beyond. And Ethan Cole did not move right away, his hands still resting on the fence, his eyes no longer fixed on the horizon, but on the space just in front of him, as if something invisible had been placed there and he was deciding whether to pick it up. Because a story being different was not something a man could force, it was something he had to choose to carry. And out here, choices had a way of following you longer than you intended. Nayeli watched him without pressing, without adding anything more, because she understood that silence was not always an absence. Sometimes it was a kind of respect, the kind that allows a thought to take root on its own. And after a moment, she stepped back from the fence, not turning away yet, just creating a little more space. Enough to show that whatever came next did not need to happen all at once. The cattle shifted again in the distance, one of them letting out a low sound that echoed briefly before fading, and the rhythm of the ranch returned in small ways, a loose board tapping lightly against the side of the barn, the creak of leather from a saddle resting nearby, things that belonged to Ethan's world and asked nothing more than his attention. And he finally straightened, his hands dropping from the rail, his posture unchanged but his gaze clearer now, as if something had settled into place, not fully, but enough. Stories out here do not change easy, he said, his voice even, not resistant, just honest. Nayeli inclined her head slightly, accepting that without argument. They do not have to change all at once, she replied, her tone steady. Only the part that comes next. And there was something in that, something that did not challenge the past, but refused to let it decide everything that followed. And Ethan considered it, not with the kind of thought that searches for flaws, but with the kind that measures whether something can be lived with, whether it fits into the way a man moves through his days. And the answer did not come in words, not immediately, but in a small shift, the way he glanced back toward his cabin, then toward the open land beyond the fence, as if seeing both with a slightly different weight than before. And after a few seconds he nodded once, not a promise, not a declaration, just an acknowledgement that he had heard her, and that sometimes was enough to begin with. Nayeli stepped back another pace, the boundary between them now a little wider again, but not colder, not distant, just natural, and she let her hand fall from the fence entirely, her fingers brushing lightly against her side as if confirming that she carried nothing she needed to hold on to. Then we will see, she said quietly, and there was no expectation in it, no demand, just an openness that left the ending unwritten. And she turned then, her steps light as she moved away from the fence, not hurried, not reluctant, just certain. The kind of certainty that comes from knowing when a moment has reached its edge. And Ethan watched her go, not with the weight of yesterday, but with a quieter awareness, something closer to respect than anything else. And as she reached the rise that led toward the trees, she did not look back, not because she needed to forget, but because she trusted what had already been set in motion, and the land between them stretched wide again, open, unchanged on the surface, but holding something new beneath it, something that did not need to be named to be real. And Ethan remained by the fence a while longer, his gaze following the line of her path until it blended into the distance. And when he finally turned away, it was not with the same sense of returning to routine, but with the understanding that routine itself could shift, just slightly, just enough, and he moved toward the barn, his steps steady, the work still waiting, always waiting, but now carrying with it a quiet question, not about what had happened, but about what would be done with it. And behind him, the wind moved once more across the field, brushing over the fence, the grass, the empty space where two people had stood, and if it carried anything with it, it was not the sound of voices or the echo of judgment, but the faint trace of something simpler, something harder to ignore once noticed, the idea that a story does not end when the crowd walks away. It continues in the choices made when no one is watching. And out here, those were the moments that decided what kind of man remained when everything else had gone quiet. The days that followed did not arrive with noise or announcement. They came the way most things do out here, quiet, steady, carried on the same wind that had always moved across the land. And Ethan Cole found himself noticing small things he had long stopped paying attention to. The way the light settled differently on the fence each morning, the sound of boots on dry earth echoing just a little longer in the early hours, the rhythm of his own work no longer just a routine, but something he measured against a different kind of silence, not the empty kind, but the kind that listens back, and he did not speak of it, not to anyone, because there was no one to tell, and even if there had been, words would have fallen short of what had changed, not because it was large, but because it was precise, like a single line drawn straighter than before, and a few miles away, beyond the stretch of trees where the land softened and the air carried the scent of pine, Nayeli moved through her own days with the same quiet awareness, not searching for meaning in what had happened, but recognizing it when it appeared in the spaces between things, in the way people paused a little longer before speaking, in the way her own voice felt different, not louder, not stronger, just certain in a way it had not needed to be before, and time passed the way it always does, marked not by events but by repetition, sun rising, work done, sun setting, until one morning, without planning it, without deciding it in any clear way, Ethan saddled his horse and rode toward Dry Creek, the road stretching ahead of him in that familiar pale line, dust rising lightly with each step, and he did not rush, did not hesitate. He simply rode, the same way he had 100 times before, but this time carrying something that did not belong to errands or trade, something quieter, something that had been set in motion the moment a voice had chosen not to remain silent. And when the town came into view, it looked unchanged, the same buildings, the same narrow street, the same sign creaking slightly above the saloon door. But as he rode in, the difference was not in what he saw, it was in how he was seen. People noticed him, of course they did, but the looks were not the same, not as quick, not as certain. Some nodded, small, almost reluctant gestures. Others looked away, not in dismissal, but in something closer to reflection, as if they had not quite finished thinking about what had happened the last time he stood among them. And Ethan dismounted near the edge of the street, tying his horse to the post with the same steady hands. And for a moment he simply stood there, not moving forward, not turning back, just allowing the space to exist as it was. And then Sheriff Walter Briggs stepped out from the doorway of his office, his hat already in his hand, as if he had been expecting this moment without knowing exactly when it would arrive. And the two men looked at each other across the short distance. No crowd this time, no noise, just the faint sound of wind moving through the gaps between buildings. And Briggs took a step forward, his voice lower than usual, stripped of the authority he once leaned on too easily. "Ethan," he said, and there was something in the way he said the name, not an apology spoken outright, but something that carried its shape. And Ethan nodded once, not dismissing it, not holding on to it either, just acknowledging it for what it was. And after a moment, Briggs added, "We should have waited." And the words settled into the space between them, simple, direct, no defense behind them. And Ethan looked at him for a second longer before answering, his voice calm. "Even, next time," he said, and that was all. No lecture, no demand, just a quiet line drawn forward instead of back. And Briggs nodded, slower this time, as if understanding that what mattered was not what had been done, but what would be done differently. And across the street, a few others watched, not closely, not intrusively, just enough to see that something had shifted, not erased, not forgotten, but adjusted, like a story that had been told again with a clearer ending. And Ethan turned then, not lingering, not waiting for more, his business in town as simple as it had always been, but the weight of it no longer the same. And as he walked down the street, the sound of his boots echoed lightly, steady, unhurried, And somewhere beyond the town, beyond the trees, Naeli stood at the edge of her world, looking out across the distance where the land opened again, and though she could not see him, she did not need to, because some stories do not need to be watched to be known. They continue in the choices people make when they believe no one else is listening. And out here, where the land remembers more than words ever could, that was enough, more than enough. Because in the end, justice did not arrive with noise or force. It arrived the moment someone chose to speak, and it stayed the moment someone chose to listen.